Hi, welcome back to Know Thy Addendum. We're still going to stick to the mantra, we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. Got it? So let's move on. So the next addendum we're going to look at is called the Real Estate Brokerage Payment Addendum. Okay? But before we go into the addendum, there's a few things we need to set up the circumstance to actually understand the addendum. And I want to get real clear. It has to do with commissions and how they're paid and such like that. So let's move on to the next slide. And there's a diagram. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is the this is the brokerage fee of the buyer agency contract. Okay, this is important to understand this. And so essentially what this says, right? If during the initial term of any extension, blah, blah, blah. So what this is saying is that when you enter into a contract to represent a buyer, which by the way, it's the law that if you want to call them your client, you must have a contract. If in order to collect a fee, you must have a contract, right? You cannot collect compensation or you cannot represent someone without a contract. Okay, so you would fill in the blank, let's say 3% for this discussion. Okay, so you represent a buyer and you want to be paid 3%. Now you can add, a dollar amount. Let's say, there are some agents in our firm that charge $350 and 3%. So, and why did they do that? Because they can, right? They just do. So what that means, and simply, they just simply make more money. And, some people believe, well, that's not fair. Well, if you believe that that's not fair, then, obviously you're not going to put anything in there. You're going to put zero. That's all there is to it. So that's a discussion for another time. So what you're saying is 3% of the acquisition price, right? But then it goes on to say, if the property acquired by the buyer is listed with a brokerage, the buyer agent commission, BAC, paid to the company by the listing brokerage shall satisfy the buyer's obligation for the brokerage fee shown above, provided that the BAC is not less than the amount shown above. So what that means is, you have a contract with a buyer, and let's say they go out and buy a property that's not listed with another broker, the buyer owes you the commission. Or let's say, for example, you have a 3% buyer agency commission, a BAC, or a brokerage fee listed here. Okay, it's actually not the BAC, it's the brokerage fee, right? So, or I guess you can call it the buyer agent commission. So anyway, so the buyer owes you that money, but let's say the property that's listed in the MLS is only offering 2%. But you're like, hey, I want my 3%. I earned it. I deserve it. I'm worth every penny. Okay. And so that now we have an issue. Okay. So you have a contract that the buyer owes you the money. Okay. So, but you're not being compensated enough by the listing to cover the buyer's obligation. So now let's look at the next slide. The next slide is a diagram of how the commissions work inside a property that is listed by another brokerage in the MLS. Okay, so you have a property that's listed in the MLS. Okay, and they're offering a BAC, but let's say the so for now we'll just go through and say, okay, so let's look at the contracts and how the commission works, right? So first you have a contract, a seller and a listing broker. They enter into an agency contract. Boom, that's a contract there. Now we know we have a buyer agency contract between the buyer and the buyer's broker. Okay, that's another agency contract. Okay, you have a contract between the buyer and the seller. Okay, that's the purchase contract. But the fourth contract that's rarely talked about or actually known or understood is the contract of the MLS. When a broker joins an MLS, they sign a contract that all listing brokers are going to offer compensation. Now, there's no rule that says how much that compensation can be. It can be, a penny. I've seen them as low as $1, and it's 2.5% is not uncommon. And let's be clear, commissions go down in a seller's market and they go up in a buyer's market. It's just, those are natural market forces in play. So anyway, so there's a contract between the listing broker and the buyer's broker, via the MLS, by being members of the MLS, they both signed the contract. And so whatever commission is offered by the broker, not by the agent, not by the, in other words, they can't put in the remarks, commission is different if X. So sometimes you'll see if you're not there on the first showing, the commission is 2% or something like that. Well, that's not, doesn't work. The only commission the agent does, you can't modify the commission with the remarks. There's a BAC field in the MLS, and that is what's owed by the listing broker to the buyer's broker. Now, there are short sale rules that can modify that, and we'll talk about that in future videos. So anyway, so these are the 4 contracts, right? So you notice the seller is not paying the buyer's broker, right? It is a myth that there are 2 commissions, right? Paid via the MLS, right? The one to the seller's agent, one to the buyer's agent. Well, that's not true. The seller pays a commission to the listing broker. The listing broker pays the buyer's broker, not the seller. The seller pays the listing broker pays the buyer's broker. So now we have the scenario. So now that you understand how commissions flow, so then, and as a buyer's broker or buyer's agent, you cannot ask the seller for more money because that's one, it's not your client. You don't have a contract with them. You cannot ask the listing broker to pay you more because that's called agency interference, right? So how do you get the money? So we'll talk about that more in the next slide. So, I needed you to understand how the commissions flow and how the contracts work here. Got it? So next slide. So let's ask the question, what if? So I have a buyer-broker agreement that includes a brokerage fee or a commission of 3%. The listing is offering less than 3%. Let's just say 2 for the sake of this discussion. They're offering a 2% as a buyer agent's commission, a BAC. Okay, so you have a couple options, right? According to the contract, the buyer's obligated to pay you automatically, right? There's no discussion there. The buyer owes you the money. Okay, so now we have to say, okay, what are we going to do? We have a few options. Number one, we can accept the 2%, or let's say it's 2.5. Let's say they're offering 2.5%, and you're saying, you know what, I'm good with that. We'll just accept it as is, move on. Okay, or you can ask the buyer to pay the difference because the buyer owes you. The buyer has an obligation. They're obligated. They have a contractual obligation to pay you the difference. Okay, so you can ask the buyer, say, hey, buyer, this property only offers 2% BAC. You in turn now owe me 1%. So and the buyer say, hey, I don't want the property, whatever. They have the option to cancel. But you can offer the buyer a third option. You can ask the seller, well, you can't ask the seller. The buyer can ask the seller to pay the difference. Because remember, in this slide, right, you can't ask the seller. You can't ask the listing broker. This is interference. This is interference too, because you don't have a contract with them. You're interfering with their agency relationship. Okay, so and you can't ask them. So, but the buyer, right, because the buyer has an obligation, so they can ask the seller. So let's look at the addendum, right? So think about it. So before we go through the language of the addendum, the buyer, it's not uncommon for a buyer to ask a seller to pay the buyer's loan cost obligation, right? That's a buyer's obligation. It's a contractual obligation that they have with the lender, a third party, if you will. Okay, so the same thing applies here, where the buyer has a contractual obligation to pay you the difference. So because the buyer has a contractual obligation, just like the buyer can ask the seller to pay the buyer's loan closing costs, the buyer can ask the seller to pay their agency contract commission obligation. It's an obligation that the buyer has. They can ask the seller to pay. So the addendum simply states, it's a short addendum. However, you needed to understand the whole, setup to understand the addendum. Okay, seller's payment to buyer's real estate brokerage. Seller agrees to pay blank, let's say it's 1% short, you put 1% in there, 1% of the purchase price to buyer's brokerage. This payment shall be made in addition to any other compensation offered by the seller's brokerage. You notice it didn't say the seller to buyer's brokerage, right? So this is in addition to what the listing broker is paying the buyer's brokerage. The provisions of this addendum shall survive closing. So, okay, so it's just that simple. So this is designed that if the listing brokerage is not offering what you need, how do you collect the money? This is a way that the buyer can ask the seller to pay its obligation. Got it? So any questions, feel free to reach out to us anytime. We are here to serve you and help you with your real estate practice. Thank you.